Alrighty, hi everyone. So, thank you for those of you who brought your instruments. I know that that was something I requested. We're not going to need them for like maybe 20 minutes, but if you have them here, please do go ahead and like unpack them, because that'll save us time when we start using them. So yeah, go ahead and like put them on the sides. Just kind of have them like half out. You don't have to tune or anything. In the meantime, I will just explain what we're doing here. So. My name is Noah. This was me when I got started once upon a time. I was a little Suzuki kid years ago. How many of you, just out of curiosity, have some sort of Suzuki experience or did? Okay, awesome. So you guys remember the deal. Yeah, so this was me getting started, learning how to bow to a D major chord. My mom still calls it the $1,000 bow because that's pretty much all she got for her efforts and her tuition money. But she was very inspired by Dr. Suzuki's philosophy, was just really intrigued at everything that he was doing. And so this is back in the 70s. I don't know how she did it, but she managed to get a hold of his phone numbers, I was going to say email addresses, but no, that wasn't it. Phone numbers, mailing addresses, and managed to like wear him down. And he agreed to teach me if we showed up. So halfway through kindergarten, flew over to Japan, took lessons with Dr. Suzuki for about 6 months. And that kind of kicked off the whole path to conservatory, like many of you may have experienced, lessons in different cities with different teachers, chamber music, youth orchestra, theory lessons, like the whole 9 yards. And I was getting the best possible training I could have asked for, but from an early age, there was something that sort of mystified and frustrated me, and I'm wondering if maybe you've had a similar experience. This is how I would have these occasional really good days on stage. How many of you have had really good days on stage? Like you sound great, it feels great, yeah, awesome. Problem is these wouldn't happen when I needed them to happen. They just sort of randomly would happen. And a lot of my days were not so good days. And these would range from just frustratingly subpar, but all the way to those like catastrophically mortifying, I don't think I can look at these people ever again kinds of days. How many of you have had something in that range of not so good days? Yeah. And so I'd go to my teachers and I'd ask questions, what's up with this inconsistency? What's up with nerves? Like, why is there always such a gap between what I know I can do and then what actually happens on stage? And usually their response was some variation, like, have you considered practicing at all or more? And they weren't wrong. I could definitely have been more diligent about practicing, but what confused me is that sometimes I would practice more and then I'd sound worse. How many of you have had that happen? And then sometimes I wouldn't really practice and I'd sound amazing. Has that happened for anybody? Yeah, and so even with that and with nerves, sometimes I'd be more nervous and I'd play better. Other times I'd be less nervous and I'd play worse. So none of it made sense. And then I kept chugging along and eventually went to Juilliard for my master's. And then I took a class with a fellow named Don Green who was teaching musicians about sport and performance psychology. How many of you have heard of sports psychology? Okay, so this is, 30 years later, I think it's much more in the sort of awareness of everyone. But I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what it meant and what it looked like. And I learned a couple things that ended up being pretty transformative that semester. One was that athletes do a lot of mental training, not just physical preparation. And I know this sounds really, really obvious. The problem was I didn't know what that looked like. So if you told me to do more mental preparation, I wouldn't have known what to do. The other thing I learned is that athletes and coaches have understood for a long time that being able to learn a skill and being able to perform that skill, especially under pressure, two very different challenges. There's overlap, of course, but you need to do different things to be able to learn and perform successfully. So after all of this, I was just increasingly intrigued by performance science and performance psychology, and so decided to stay in school, went to Indiana to do my master's and PhD in psychology. So that kind of brings me to where we are today. And before we get started with anything, I wanted to play a quick game of epic or fail. Maybe some of you have seen this. So what I want to do is just play a clip of this video, and I'm going to ask you before, this is Skimbles, by the way. Skimbles is a cat from New Zealand. Skimbles is going to do a thing, but before it does, I'm going to pause the video and ask you to tell me if what's about to happen is going to be epic or fail. So let's take a quick look here. Okay, so who thinks this is going to be epic? Got a few. Okay, who thinks this is going to be a fail? You got more people rooting against the cat, it seems. All right, let's take a look here. So you laugh, yes, but how many of you can empathize with poor skimbles? How many of you have pulled a skimbles at some point or another in your lives? Yeah. So this, of course, is called choking in sports. It's extremely common. It happens to even the highest level athletes. Historically great championship level athletes are not immune to choking. And so this is essentially what I wanted to explore in the time that we have, because I was always confused about this gap between practice and performance. And sure, practice is a part of that, dealing with nerves is part of that, but there's a crucial aspect of performance that we rarely think about and often gets overlooked, and that has to do with attention control, as in what are we thinking about and what should we be thinking about when we're on stage in the middle of an audition or performance under pressure. So what I wanted to explore today in the time that we have are the two reasons why we tend to choke under pressure, one key attention control strategy that can help you become more pressure proof, and then how to practice this in advance of performances or auditions. So what causes choking under pressure? There are two theories that explain this, and both seem to be valid. So that basically means that there are two different ways in which we could choke under pressure, sometimes both. One of the theories are called self-focused theories, or explicit monitoring, or conscious processing theories. And you've all experienced this in various parts of your life, most likely. How many of you, for instance, have ever had to sit on camera for like an interview or something? How many of you realize or remember when you were sitting on camera, like you forgot how to sit like a normal person? You became very stiff, very awkward, very uncomfortable. Yeah, how many of you have ever had to walk in front of a bunch of people who are watching you walk and suddenly became, again, very self-conscious and awkward and couldn't walk like a normal person? Yeah, so this is, smiling is actually another good example of this. So this is a little bit oversimplified, but basically what's happening is when you're learning a new skill, there tends to be more activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain in green over there. And that's great. You're telling yourself what to do, what not to do, what to do with your shoulder, where your right thumb should be, et cetera, and that's all fine. However, when you get to a point where all of these skills are now automated and you don't have to think about those itty-bitty details anymore, there's a different part of your brain that tends to be more active, the cerebellum, which is this other part in green on the screen there. And the problem is we don't have conscious access to the cerebellum. So anytime you're in a performance situation and you start like overthinking the mechanics and the details of what to do, usually what happens is we start activating the prefrontal cortex again, interrupts the cerebellum's ability to do its job, and we end up often making mistakes or just playing a little bit more awkwardly or less fluidly than we can. How many of you have had teachers ever tell you at some point, maybe in a lesson, stop thinking so much, like just trust yourself, just do it? This is exactly what they're talking about. And so we'll get back to this in a second in terms of what to do about it. But the other set of theories that explains why this happens, these are called distraction theories. And there are a lot of different ways in which we can get distracted. Classic example is, how many of you have ever worried about a difficult passage coming up so far in advance that when you got to it, like you ended up messing it up? Yeah, or how many of you, this is actually maybe even worse. How many of you especially like in recording situations, right? Like you're making an audition tape and it's going so well and you don't want to screw it up. And so as you get closer and closer to the end, you start feeling more and more kind of self-imposed pressure. How many of you have gotten close to the end? You see the finish line in sight. There's this one moderately, not even super difficult hurdle to get past. And you get past it, but you start celebrating too soon and then you mess up something that's never happened before. Yeah, right? So either way, whether you're worried about it or celebrating, something can go wrong. Another example is memory. How many of you have had a memory slip specifically because you were worrying about your memory at that moment? Yeah, so some of these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies tend to be common. Another classic example is just wondering what people are thinking. What's the audition committee going to say, or what's my teacher going to say? And as we're worrying about those things, things can go off the rails. So the common element in these two different theories is that, again, they're both related to attention. And this is important because we only have so much attention capacity that we can devote to any one thing that's happening around us. It's fixed, it's limited, there's nothing we can do really to expand it. It's another way of saying that we don't actually multitask as effectively as we might like to think that we do, although how many of you consider yourselves to be good multitaskers? Yeah, just arms up high if you think you are. Okay, so that's a fair number of you. Statistically, it's unlikely that many of you in a group this size are actually effective multitaskers. The research suggests that these people do exist. They're called supertaskers, and that's like 2 to 2.5% of the general population. If you put them in a car and ask them to navigate an obstacle course, and you ask them to do like long division in their head, these people can do those two things just as accurately and effectively and quickly together as they would separately. I know that that's not me, and I don't know about you, and I wish we could test each other out, but I don't have a way of doing this here. I do, however, have a couple multitasking challenges that we can try just to get kind of a taste of multitasking to see how it feels. So this first one, this is the Old MacDonald challenge. What I'm gonna have you do is sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm in your head quietly to yourself. At the same time, I would like you to count backwards from 100 by 3. Right, it's like 197, 94, etc. So you're gonna do the counting out loud, but the singing in your head. And if you don't remember the lyrics to Old MacDonald, that's fine. Just Happy Birthday works, the ABC song works. So start the singing. And now 100. So I heard the math start to go off the rails already. But how is the singing going? How many of you finding that the singing is stopping and starting and rough? Okay. Yeah, usually people get tripped up in the transition from 91 to 88, but I think I heard some people say 95, so things went off pretty quickly. All right, so that's one example of multitasking. Here's another quick one. This is, again, not scientifically valid. It's from BuzzFeed, but it's kind of fun. So let's take a quick try here.
In the summer of 2015, I finally got my driver's license. I was so excited that I'd earned the freedom to go wherever I wanted. My mum congratulated me on the hard work and surprised me with my favourite ice cream cake. As I took my first bite of the chocolate crunches, my mum told me that anytime I wanted to borrow her minivan, all I had to do was fill out a 5-page request form that had over 30 questions on it. I'm so glad my mum treats me like an adult now.
Yeah, so it was ice cream cake with chocolate crunches, I believe. So. I mean, so it's 1 of 4 chance, right? There's only 4 of them. I don't hear a consensus. What, fall? I think I heard fall. Someone said summer. So fall and summer seem to be the two. Summer, yes. Some of you are thinking, who was Linda? Right. But you're right. Big trout. So again, hopefully this gave you a very quick taste of how crazy making true multitasking can be. The problem though is even though I've tried to make a very quick case for why we don't multitask as effectively as we think we do, there's still part of your brain that's thinking, yeah, but I multitask all the time and I do so probably pretty effectively. And it can seem that way because as you get more and more experienced and familiar with a task or a skill, the cognitive demands of that task become less and less. So let's diagram this out real quick. So let's say that the empty circle there, that's the amount of brain power that you have, which is fixed and limited. The colored circle, those are the cognitive demands of any given task. And again, that's fluid and that changes from beginning of a task to as you become more skilled. And there are these 3 stages of learning that have been identified or proposed way back in the day. And so let's take driving as an example. How many of you remember the very first time you drove a car? Do you remember how overwhelming that felt? Yeah. Now, most likely when you drive and you go somewhere that's familiar that you go all the time, you probably get to the destination and have no recollection of the drive at all, right? How many of you are totally on autopilot? How many of you have actually gone to the wrong place? because you weren't paying attention or took the wrong exit. Yeah. So in the early stages of learning a skill, the cognitive stage, you don't have the bandwidth to like think about anything else. Listen to the radio, have a conversation. You were just focused on driving, or maybe first rehearsal or something like that. As you go through the stages of learning, more and more cognitive bandwidth frees up because more and more stuff has become automated. So at the associative stage, maybe you've been driving for a couple months. Now, you can listen to music that's familiar. Maybe you can have a basic conversation with someone in the car, but still you do need to focus on what's happening around you pretty carefully. Eventually you get to the autonomous stage. This is where you are now, and you go driving and you can pretty much, or folding laundry, brushing your teeth. There are a lot of things we do nowadays that you don't really have to think too much about because much of the skill is automated. The problem with this, and you might notice this on a day-to-day basis, is when you're at the autonomous stage with a skill, because you don't have to think about the details of the skill anymore, like brushing your teeth or washing the dishes, your brain, by default, will tend to wander and think about unrelated things. How many of you, for instance, when you brushed your teeth this morning, were not actually thinking about brushing your teeth, but just other things? Yeah. It's totally fine. Your teeth are probably pretty clean. However, the problem with the autonomous stage when it comes to high-level performance under pressure is your brain will wander to things that are not relevant and not helpful and are more likely to lead to choking under pressure, like worrying about difficult passages coming up or the audience or what you're going to have for dinner and so forth. So this is something that athletes are very much aware of, especially in certain sports. I heard a really interesting podcast episode maybe 4 or 5 years ago with Shawn Johnson. She won gold in 2008, I think on beam. She represented the US team. And she said in this episode that in addition to working really hard to map out and choreograph and rehearse the physical script for every single routine, she said she also needed to map out and choreograph and script in practice a mental routine for every routine. As in, what exactly am I going to think about from one second to the next? And she said that if she didn't have this mapped out, her mind would wander to things like worrying about getting hurt, worrying about messing up, worrying about her score, the judges, other competitors, and so forth. So we'll talk about what this looks like for musicians in a moment, but I wanted to have you watch one more video just to kind of see what happens when you have a really clear focus on something very specific. So let's take a quick look.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes.
Okay, who got 16? Excellent. Who saw the gorilla? Who saw one of the players on the black team leaving? Who saw the curtain changing color? Okay, so hopefully all of you missed at least one of those things. And for those of you who missed the gorilla, just real quick, who missed the gorilla? Who has no idea what I'm talking about? Okay. Let's take a look here.
Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
So for those of you who missed the gorilla, isn't it amazing that something so obvious could go by like that? Right, so actually, for those of you who missed the gorilla, you guys actually did exactly what needs to happen, right? You were so focused on counting. Yeah, that's right. You were so focused on counting the passes that basically you told your brain, if it has nothing to do with counting passes, ignore it. And your brain did exactly that. And so that's a kind of laser-like focus that we actually want in performance. But the question, of course, is, well, what is the metaphorical equivalent of counting passes in performance or audition situations? Just FYI, this is a phenomenon known as perceptual blindness or inattentional blindness. And this is what we're going to take advantage of in order to be able to deal more effectively with nerves, get into the zone more consistently, and just play the way that you can play without overthinking. So what is the metaphorical equivalent of counting passes? Well, so this is a tricky thing. It actually kind of depends on the situation. So for instance, if you're in an orchestra situation. There might be times for like half a second where the metaphorical equivalent of counting passes is going to be paying attention to the conductor. Other times, maybe what the conductor's doing is not the most important thing you need to be, well, don't tell them I said this, but may not be the most important thing that needs to happen. You might need to focus on things happening closer around you in the section, maybe the section leader or your colleagues around you and so forth. If you're playing with a pianist, there might be times where the pianist's part is maybe not so important or central, and there are things that you need to focus on with your playing. Other times where focusing more on the pianist is more important than your part. Or in a quartet situation, I remember doing an interview with Roger Tapping, the late Roger Tapping, who's in the Juilliard Quartet, and he said, he didn't say which piece it was, but he said there's one particular piece where there's this one passage that always kind of gave him some trouble, because he had a tendency to overthink it, until he discovered that at that moment, if instead of thinking about his part, he just focused only on what the cellist was doing, no problem, always worked out. So things like that can vary from situation to situation. One of the hardest situations, though, to stay focused in is orchestral auditions, because it's just you. There's no other part to focus on. There's nothing happening around you to focus on. Even the audience is removed in some ways. So there are a number of strategies that can be used, and as you talk to more musicians, you find more and more kind of variations of different strategies that are helpful for staying focused in the morning. There are three that I usually talk about. There's a sound-based strategy, a rhythm-based strategy, and an improvisation-based strategy. Given the limits of time, we might be limited to just one. If I had to pick just one, the one that I would be more inclined to focus on is the sound-based strategy, because it's probably going to be somewhat familiar to many of you. You've probably used it, but maybe not specifically for attention control. So let's take a look at how this can help us. So the technical term for this strategy is anticipatory auditory imagery. But how many are your brass players? Okay, so you will also know this by a different name. This is essentially all the stuff that Arnold Jacobs used to talk about and shared in his teaching. So Arnold Jacobs, legendary tuba player in the Chicago Symphony, essentially intuited many, many years ago that it was more effective when performing to focus on the sound that you wanted coming out of your instrument, instead of like over focusing or micromanaging the mechanics or the technique involved or evaluating the sound that was coming out. And this is something that is now in the motor learning literature known as adopting a distal external focus, or an external focus of attention, where the goal is to focus on the goal of your motor movements as opposed to the motor movements themselves. And I don't think this is why Glenn Gould did this, but it's essentially the sort of thing that Glenn Gould did. So you can take a quick look here in case it's been a while. So I'm not going to have you sing out loud, because teachers do that and embarrasses us. Although, how many of you have studied with a teacher who, when you were playing through something in a lesson, you would sometimes hear them like singing or humming to help guide and shape what they wanted you to do in that moment? Yeah. So my teacher in college was sort of notorious for this. She didn't even bother to like sing in any sort of pitch. It was this completely atonal, like wailing, moaning, like hands waving around kind of thing. But it was extremely communicative. Like, it let me know exactly where she wanted me to grow and like move forward and hold back and articulate, and all these ingredients were just kind of wrapped up into this sort of vocal conducting that she did. And so that's one way of doing this, is very kind of abstract vocalizing that we can keep internally in our mind to essentially keep us focused on what we want in that moment without overthinking the mechanics and the details or going into the future or into the past. The other way of doing this is much more literal. This is where you're going to audiate instrumental sound in your head. So you're going to hear bassoon sound or violin sound or piano sound or whatever the case may be. Are there any singers in the room? Okay. So for singers, it's going to be slightly varied. So for singers, the vocal version, that's the literal version. This is where you're like singing in your head as you're singing out loud, or humming in your head as you're singing out loud. And the instrumental version would be where you actually audiate instrumental sound. So I worked with a singer, I remember maybe a few months or a year ago, and what he described doing that really helped him was to focus on, I think it was trombone sound at one part of his vocal range, and then I think clarinet at a different part of his vocal range. You don't have to do anything that complicated. It could just be one instrument for the entirety of your range. But he found it helpful to focus on instrumental sound instead of getting too caught up in the mechanics of vocalizing. So what I want to do is try these, because usually people have a preference, and so we have to figure out what your preference is. If you have your instrument here, do go ahead and get it out. I know some of you have already done that. I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. Yeah, I'll give you a minute, get your instrument out. Feel free to tune, warm up, play a few notes. I'm not going to make any of you play individually, so don't worry. Like, you're all just going to play as a group together. Alrighty, excellent. So as we do this, this is going to work best if you do this with something that you know relatively well already. You don't want to do this with something you're sight reading or something that you're still trying to figure out because you don't have enough cognitive bandwidth to just play and trust that your muscles know what they need to do. So yeah, all you need is maybe like one line or like 10 seconds of something that you know well. And I'm going to ask you to play it a couple times. First off, just play it once so that your fingers get a little bit warmed up and you just remember how it goes. So anytime you're ready, or maybe you want me to count down, that way everyone starts at the same time. Yeah, just play one line and then stop. So 3, 2, 1, begin. Okay, terrific. So I'm just out of curiosity, I'm curious what you were thinking about as you were playing. Can I ask you, what was going through your mind as you were playing? Okay, so telling yourself to play in tune, all right. Bassoon over here, what were you thinking about? Okay, yeah, so kind of monitoring how things are going. Trombone in the back. Okay, so some things related to don't screw up and basically, oh crap, I screwed up, seem to be the theme here. Well, yeah, I mean, it's the morning, it's freezing outside, you haven't warmed up, to be expected. So let's try these two different attention control strategies, well, the variations of the same attention control strategy, and just see how it feels. So what I'd like you to do now is play the exact same thing, except this time just trust your muscles to do what they know how to do. Meanwhile, keep your mind focused just on singing or humming or vocalizing in some way in your head. So again, this is not instrumental sound, this is vocal sound. Whether it has pitch or not doesn't really matter. So same thing, go ahead and play. 3, 2, 1, begin. Okay, terrific, thank you. So that's one way of doing this. The other way of doing this, again, is where you're audiating more instrumental sounds in your head. So actual bassoon sound or viola sound, trombone sound, bass sound, etc. The way that I describe this to people, just to make it really clear what our mental goal is to imagine that you're performing for an audience of deaf psychics or an audition committee of deaf psychics. So essentially walk into the hall, you see an audience, but they're all deaf. So they cannot hear if you play out of tune or if you miss a note or chip a note or are rushing or the string crossings are sloppy. Like, they have no idea, but they can read your mind. So if you are worrying about the fact that there's a difficult shift coming up, or you're beating yourself up for having played something out of tune, or you're wondering what kind of protein you want on your burrito bowl later, like your psychic audience is gonna have a very confusing experience of that performance. So you have to make sure the only thing they can hear in your head is the sound that you want them to hear. So let's try this again, same exact passage, and see if this feels any better or worse than the singing version. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, great. So between those two, the first one's a warm-up. So the singing version or the instrumental version, who felt more naturally just engaged and connected with the singing version? Okay, who felt more naturally connected with the instrumental version? Okay, who wasn't quite sure, like maybe it could go either way depending on what you're playing? Yeah, so most folks are gonna find one or the other works better. And some folks will find that they're either not sure or depending on what they're playing, maybe more technical things work better with one or like more lyrical things work better with another. If that's the case, if you felt like maybe you could use either, feel free to play around with both and experiment. Some people actually find that like a hybrid of the two works for them. But if you felt like one was distracting and the other one seemed to work well, don't worry about trying to get better at the distracting one. Just go with the one that felt more naturally comfortable, and that's the one that's probably gonna work best for you. So that's one of the strategies that we can utilize to get a little bit better at staying present in the moment. We might have a little time, so I want to share another one with you that could be interesting to experiment with. This one tends to be a little bit more mixed, usually at first, and there's specific reasons for that. But let's try it. So you could play the same thing that you just played, or you could pick something new if you'd like. But what I'd like you to do is imagine you're at like a competition or an audition or something, and the goal is to play this one passage like perfectly. So the goal is to like not screw up. I would never say that to somebody in real life, but basically you're trying to play perfectly and not make any mistakes. So go ahead and on the count of 3, let's try this passage, the perfect version of it. So 3, 2, 1, go. All right, thank you. So that's one version. Now let's try it again. This time, you're still going to try to play it as well as you can, except what I'd like you to focus on is offering subtle new nuances to your performance, like little spontaneous details here and there, not planned, just whatever strikes your fancy in the moment. So this might be like an extra half wiggle vibrato here and there, something slightly different with the color of your sound, the articulation, the shape of the phrase. It doesn't matter if you like it or if you ever do it again. Just for now, the idea is to experiment more freely. Kind of like how, you know, if you're in a chamber music group that you trust, this often happens a little bit more naturally. Go ahead and try that with this passage as well. So 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so it's kind of hard to do this in a group setting, the Q&A bit. So between the two, who had more, well, I don't know, maybe just get somebody to say something about it. One of you somewhere in this area, the string players, what was your experience the first time versus the second time? Did you notice anything? I know you're all looking at each other, so I'm like, who's gonna say something?
I think I got good results from both of them, but the first one was a lot more like stress inducing, and the second one felt easier, I think.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. I mean, you practice the first way all the time, so in theory that should be pretty solid. A lot of times what people will describe is the second way feels more free. How many of you felt like it was more fun, it's more free, maybe more expressive? How many of you also, though, felt like the second one might have been a little bit scarier in a way or less technically secure? perhaps. You might have made little mistakes here and there, yeah. So that's usually what will happen the first few times, because this is essentially you taking a lot more risks, or little tiny micro risks, which you may not have prepared for in the past. However, there's some benefits to doing this in advance. So some of you may have studied with or crossed paths with violist Toby Apple, who's on the faculty at Juilliard. And he says that he doesn't practice what he's going to do in performance as much as he practices all the things that he might do on stage in performance. And this is essentially a form of what's called variable practice. We tend to engage in what's called constant practice, where we figure out exactly how we want something to go, and we practice trying to play it exactly that way, as close to that ideal that we have over and over consistently. And that sounds like the right thing to do. However, if you look at a lot of the research that's taken place in the last few decades in motor learning, variable practice studies look like, for instance, in one basketball study, they had a group of people practice shooting from 8 feet away, 12 feet away, and 15 feet away. And then one group practiced shooting only at 12 feet. So you would think that the 12-foot group would have an advantage when tested at 12 feet. However, the group that split their practice shots between 8, 12, and 15 were actually more accurate at 12 feet than the group that only practiced at 12 feet, because they cultivated a more robust set of motor programs that were more adaptable and flexible. If you think about it, if you sound great in your practice room or your living room, that's terrific. But when you go on stage, the acoustics are very different, like your hands are colder, you might have to play louder or articulate differently, et cetera. And so we suddenly have to take risks anyway that we haven't really prepared for. So the idea is to practice taking these risks in tiny doses in advance in the practice room, which not only makes practicing more fun, but also means that it's a little more challenging in a good way, where we cultivate what Martin Krauss, the famous pianist, called reserves of technique. So this may result in some little tiny mistakes sooner in the process when you're practicing. However, in the long run, it can help you be more robust and reliable and accurate when it counts. But the interesting thing is this is also like a mental strategy that can help, in the sense that it tends to keep you more focused on creating in each moment as opposed to like replicating. How many of you had that feeling that you were like kind of creating something in the moment as opposed to like trying to repeat something that you've done? Yeah. And it also has an interesting audience benefit. There was an Arizona State study where they had the orchestra there perform the last movement of the Brahms First Symphony 2 times. One time, their instructions were to give the best performance they could. Another time, their instructions were to offer subtle new nuances to the performance. That's where I got that phrase. And what they found when they had about 150 community choir members listen to both recordings is that most of the audience members had a preference. 88% preferred, or had a preference. 83% preferred the subtle nuance version. So something does tend to come across. And if you try this with students, or you try this with yourself or with colleagues, oftentimes you'll notice not only does it sound different, but the people, when they play with the subtle nuances, they also look different when they play. Like they seem more kind of in the moment and more invested and more engaged in what they're doing in that moment. So anyhow, that's another strategy that can be really useful in these sorts of situations as well. So once you've started to flesh out your mental script, you have a clear sense of like what to focus on from moment to moment when you're performing. This mental script also does have to be practiced just like the physical script that you practice with all of your shifts and bowings and so forth. Because if you don't practice the mental script in advance, you're not going to trust it in performance pressure situations, and then you're not going to use it. So why is it so important to practice this? Well, if you think about what's happening in an effective practice session, not only are you playing, but you're also self-monitoring, you're critiquing, you're evaluating, you're analyzing, you're judging, you're problem-solving and making adjustments. There's a lot of thinking happening when you're practicing effectively. When you're performing effectively, generally most of those things are quiet, like you're just performing, you're just playing. The self-analysis and the self-monitoring, the critique, the judgment, that often generally quiets down when you're having one of those really awesome performances where you're in the zone. The problem with this, you see that I've crossed off self-monitoring. The problem is when you're not self-monitoring, you could be playing out of tune, or you might be rushing, or you could be dragging. You might think you're doing something with the phrase, but it's not actually coming across. How many of you have listened to a recording where like you thought you were really doing this thing in a particular section, and you actually can't hear it on the recording at all? Yeah, for better or for worse. Sometimes you think you were making a mess of things. It actually doesn't sound that bad when you listen back. So this is the number one reason for me, at least, to record. Not to make yourself feel bad about how you sound, but to give yourself an opportunity to be able to just play and see if the things that you want are coming through in muscle memory. It's another way of saying that basically when you record yourself, the idea is to delegate all of the evaluative stuff and the analysis and the judgment and critique to future you when you listen back. So you can just in that moment play, engage with your mental script, and trust that script. So we're going to try one quick exercise. When my family got a puppy, this is kind of new to us, and the breeder said, hey, you know what, you can let it off leash in the house if you want, but you need to be engaged with the puppy, like you can't just let it wander off. If it wanders off or you wander off, it's just going to pee on the carpet like immediately. I was like, all right, well, that makes sense. We live in New York City. It is not a big space. Like you can almost touch one side of the room and the other. And so I was like, I'm going to go grab some water from the kitchen. I can see the dog or the puppy from the kitchen. It's like right there. So I went, got some water, came back. It had peed on the carpet. So I don't know how it did this. Like there's only a few seconds span of time, but it peed on the carpet. And basically what I learned is like our brain is kind of like a puppy that's going to pee. So in this particular exercise, I want you to see if you can stay focused on the strategy that we've established, either the singing or the micro improvisation. And if at some point your brain starts to wander, it's going to pee on the carpet. So you basically have to just keep your brain from peeing on the carpet is what this exercise is all about. So let's try this. Pick one of the two strategies that we looked at, either the audiation strategy, whether the singing or the instrumental version, or the micro improvisation that we just did if you want to. And then you're going to play until I stop you. But as you play, every time your mind starts to wander, I want you to kind of gently guide it back to whichever strategy that you've tried. And I'm also going to try to distract you a little bit. I don't know if I'm going to be successful in that, but I'll try. And then I'll ask you for a score, a focus score, 10 being awesome and 1 being non-existent. So are you guys ready? 3, 2, 1, begin.
Mommy shark do 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 do.
Daddy shark do 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 do.
Grandma. Yes. Grandma shark do 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 do.
Grandpa shark do 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 do. Let's go hunt do 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 do. Let's go hunt.
Wait. Huh? Auntie shark do 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 do.
Okay, so scale of 1 to 10, 10 being awesome, focus, 1 being non-existent. What were your numbers over here? 7, okay. 4, nice. Over here, maybe 7.5 is fine. Yeah. 6, 7. Yeah. You can just shout out numbers. What else? Yeah. 5. Okay. Excellent. So this is the one time you have my blessing to listen to or watch YouTube videos when you're practicing, when you're testing your mental script. Because the idea is to try to distract yourself and see if you can stay focused past that. A lot of times it's easier to practice focus with active distractions. And eventually you can just take the distractions away and see if you can stay focused when there's complete silence, which sometimes is even harder. So, last thing that I wanted to share with you before we do questions. Actually, no, let's just do questions. We have maybe 10 minutes for questions. So whether it's related to anything we talked about today or maybe things that are tangential, I think we have a person that's going to help facilitate questions. So raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, and there's like a mic going around. I think we have a question up here in the middle.
Hi.
Yeah.
If you are in performance and you're starting to recognize that you're about to start drifting away, what could be a good tip to like kind of catch back on the zone?
Yeah, so if you practice this in advance, and I'll say a couple things about that. If you practice this in advance, you'll get to the point where you start to like feel your attention wandering away because it deviates from this script that you have. And the script is not this rigid thing necessarily, but it's basically a set of principles. And so the way to practice this is to have clear moments in your practice, especially in the lead up to an audition or competition or performance, where you divide like practice time from performance practice time. The last time I was at this conference, I was with Rob Knopper, the percussionist in the Met Opera, and one of the things that he did leading up to his Met audition, I really liked. He did this for months in advance of even mock auditions. But what he did is, I think of it as like inverting the daily practice routine. He used to warm up and then practice, and then record himself. There are lots of problems with that. Well, actually, so if you want to build confidence, that's a helpful way to do this. However, what he realized is that this recording at the end of a day led to an artificially inflated level of playing that didn't actually represent what he would sound like on audition day, right? Because you've gotten comfortable, you've worked out the kinks, and now you've kind of calibrated things up a bit. And so what he wanted to do is get better at, and this is related to what's called the mastery illusion. What he wanted to do is expose the mastery illusion and find out what things were most likely to sound like on audition day, so he could work specifically on those things and really raise the floor of his playing. And so, again, months in advance of mocks, he started short warm-up, record first before touching anything, and then practice what needed to be practiced based on that exposure of the things that needed work. And so during those moments where you record yourself and you test yourself and you practice performing, that's when you want to practice your mental script and practice attention control and see where your mind goes and see what aspects of your muscle memory you can trust and not trust. And so if you do this daily, if you do this regularly, you start to cultivate as much trust or kind of alignment with your mental script as you do with your physical script. So you know when it's starting to drift. In the same way that you know, oh, I don't feel comfortable with this shift or this passage, you also start to know where your mind is likely to wander and when it starts to wander, and you're able to then kind of reinforce your mental script and also keep it on track a little bit more effectively. The problem is we just tend not to practice it very much, right? Because we practice practicing more often, that sort of judgmental, analytical, critical aspect of thinking. We practice that all the time and we get really good at it. And this is why sometimes you'll notice that kids are sometimes better at performing in a way before they get older, because they haven't learned to overthink and critique and judge yet. Like, they're just playing. And that's kind of what we have to be able to find a way to get back to, by not just by letting our mind wander, but by putting our mind on very specific things that like help us retrieve those skills when we need to. So hopefully that helps, and it's not too much information to that question. Yeah.
Hi, this is very, very helpful. My name is Holly. I'm a bass player, but I'm also a bass teacher and a strings teacher. And I was wondering, well, you're just talking a little bit about how, oh my God, about how kids don't have the same experience with overthinking, but I was wondering if you have any experience with kind of incorporating some of the practices that you're talking about today with younger students who are maybe starting to get to that stage where they're learning about overthinking and anxiety and performances, and where you start with introducing them to these things.
Yeah, I think this is something that can be very organically introduced into teaching, even without like saying the word nerves or anxiety or anything like that, because, you know, they'll, like, I didn't have the vocabulary for it when I was getting nervous at age 5. I just knew that I was uncomfortable and I didn't feel confident on stage. One of the things that you're probably already doing but can help is, you know, just having tiny doses of performance practice integrated into the routine much more frequently and organically. There's this really great Dutch study that I like that looked at basketball. Basically, they took national team players and they divided them up into 2 groups. And over the course of 5 weeks, I think they had maybe 9 practices. All they did is they added 96 additional practice free throws into their practice session. Not 96 per practice, it was just 96 total. So it's like basically like 11 extra free throws for each practice session, which is not a lot. The only difference is one half of the team, they practiced these extra free throws just normally, no pressure. The other half of the team, they practiced with pressure. So like in front of each other with money at stake, coaches watching, being videotaped for like form analysis, et cetera. And it's, again, what I love about the study, it was not a lot of extra performance practice. Very easy to integrate, into weekly lessons or even daily with parents, friends, so forth. What they found is the normal practice group, they continued to get worse under pressure when they had to shoot free throws. The group that practiced with just a tiny bit of pressure much more frequently, not only did they not get worse, they actually performed significantly better under pressure than they did without the pressure. And how many of you have had performances where there's like just enough pressure and nerves that like you actually perform better or play better? Yeah, so that's essentially what happened for them. And so it seems to me that, you know, through this study and others, that if we can integrate tiny, tiny doses that aren't super uncomfortable, right? Because if you have a student do like a full recital kind of thing in advance of their actual recital, like that's time, it's energy, it's investment, it's pressure. But if it's just tiny doses, like 30 seconds here and there, that can, you know, even 10 seconds and then build up. That can be a helpful way, I think, to start integrating this. And then while they're doing the performance practice, it's an opportunity to have them practice other mental skills, like the singing. Try the singing, imagine you're composing this on the spot, or even things like, just practicing breathing before they start. Things like that can start to become much more organic and part of their normal routine. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about new nuances earlier. Could you elaborate a little bit more on some maybe audition advice? Because most people in this room will either be embarking on audition season pretty soon or within the next few years. So could you give a little bit more advice on how people can prepare for audition season, and maybe what are some healthy tips?
Yeah, the subtle nuance thing can work for auditions too. The only thing that has to happen in advance is you do have to do a little bit more excerpt research and listen to a wide range of different recordings to make sure you're not doing something that is too wildly inappropriate and it's going to make the committee uncomfortable and not trust you. So excerpt research can help with that, but then also playing for a bunch of different people, not just playing for people who play your instrument or just 2 or 3 people, but playing for maybe a couple dozen people across a wide range of instruments. And then if you play in a variety of different ways, the subtle nuances, again, can be super, super subtle. On the level of an extra half wiggle of vibrato here and there, nothing super obvious that someone would notice dramatically different from what you did the time before. But if you play for a bunch of people, it can help you then get a clearer sense of, can I trust these choices that I've made? Can I really believe in these choices I've made? Because, you might have the greatest 3 people to play for that you could ask for, and nothing against them, but if 2 out of 3 of them say, I think you should play this a little bit faster, it's hard to ignore that advice because these are trusted mentors of yours. However, maybe those 2 people studied with the same teacher or went to the same music festival or been in the same orchestra for a long time, and that is their expectation for how that particular section should go. But maybe, 3/4 of the people behind the screen in this other orchestra have had different experiences, which kind of create a different ballpark of expectations for them, where playing it faster might actually take you further away from their expectations. And this is where the larger a sample of people you can include in any given study, the more reliable the results are likely to be, because you've been sort of insulated against outliers. And so this is where playing for a bunch of people is not just uncomfortable, and you get more comfortable being uncomfortable, but you also get a lot more helpful feedback and data if you look at it as trends, right? So it's not, let's do everything that every single person says, but given that if you play for a couple dozen people, some of them are going to say the opposite of one another, as long as there's no clear trend in one direction, that you're probably okay. Or, if half of them say, I think you should play this a little bit faster, then you're probably going to run up against people behind the screen who think the same way. So for lots of different reasons, playing more and playing for more people can be a helpful way to prepare. Yeah, you can go ahead even without a mic, perhaps.
Oh, okay. Had one question. If you had a tip for getting into and maintaining a flow state when an event may trigger a long-standing trauma that you're going through or have been processing. So you're able to get into the flow state, but sometimes the trauma makes it a little bit more fuzzy, so it's less reliable, even though it's been reliable in the past. If you have a tip for navigating that.
That's an excellent question, and it's the direction in which a lot of sports psychology is starting to look trauma, because we don't have to think of trauma as being like trauma with a capital T. We might just have had a really emotional, in a bad sort of way, audition experience, a performance experience that then triggers some of these kind of residual effects that are really difficult to kind of prepare for. I can't say that I have a great short answer for you that I can offer, other than I've had some students, there's one in particular that occurs to me, who had trauma in one aspect of their life, unrelated at all to music, but it was still continuing to affect them in performance situations because some of the physical and emotional and mental experiences of that were kind of overlapping. And they found it really, really helpful to work with a psychologist who specialized in trauma. They found that unexpectedly had lots of helpful results in their own performing and audition experience. And so I would say that if you've experienced trauma, whether it's related to music or not, it can be really helpful to work with someone who specializes in trauma. And this is now a specialty area with specific training that psychologists or therapists can go into. It's something that, I want to say regular or no, but there are a lot of psychologists who have not been trained in trauma. And so they're maybe not able to address it quite as well or effectively, because there's some new methodologies and some approaches that can help. So I would say that would probably be the best advice I could share in that short span of time. But yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, real quick.
Oh, I'm standing up. Hello. My name is Nicholas. I'm a violist. I had a question about beta blockers. What is your opinion on them?
So the short version is that, so there are two components of performance anxiety. There's cognitive anxiety and there's somatic anxiety, somatic being the physical stuff. For some people, if you take the somatic stuff off the table, then mentally they're exactly where they need to be and then they can perform effectively. For other people, you take the somatic symptoms away, they're still overthinking, they're worried, they're doubting, et cetera. And so performance tends not to change very much. Because beta blockers don't have a direct effect on the psychological aspect of nerves. And so this is why some people will swear by them, some people will say it did nothing, or maybe it was even distracting and unhelpful. I don't have like any particular moral or ethical stance on them. The only thing I would say is just understand what they do, right, and what they don't. Because a lot of times the mental aspect of performance, the cognitive anxiety, is more predictive of performance than the somatic anxiety. The other thing too is that sometimes, again, if we need to get kind of into our optimal zone of functioning to have more energy to play well, sometimes beta blockers can detract from that. So the only thing I would really say is make sure that you've tested them out in actual situations, not just in mocks, but like in actual situations where your heart rate and your physical state's going to be where it is, where you need them. And also make sure that these are things that are being supervised by a physician and not just being sort of passed around from colleague to colleague, et cetera, because while pretty safe, there still are some situations where they can cause problems with pre-existing conditions. So that's the main takeaway. Just make sure there's a physician involved if this is something that one is experimenting with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask how we can use some of these processes in regards to interviews, public speaking, as some like high-profile fellowships or artist residencies do require like a final round of interview with like, you know, the executive director, or like, you know, you're in the boardroom with the chair of, you know, just like the board of directors, things like that. Like, how can we use some of these?
Yeah, there are definitely some sports psychology techniques and strategies that can be useful. We didn't necessarily talk about the ones that would relate directly to interviews today. However, the aspect of like practice performing is very good advice, as we all know. But the tip that I will provide, those of you who haven't already, how many of you have used ChatGPT's like kind of voice activated like speaking mode? Yeah, that actually does a pretty good job with interview prep. Like if you tell it what you're interviewing for and what the situation is and so forth, I think there's a limit to the free version. But what it'll do is it'll create a little bit of that pressure of feeling like you need to be concise and you need to get your point across, you need to be articulate. Because if you hesitate for too long or you ramble for too long, it will cut you off and then tell you to restate that or give you some ideas. So it does give you helpful feedback, but it also creates that pressure of feeling like you need to be concise and articulate at the same time. So that would be a good place to start practicing before you then go to actual humans who can help you practice that as well. So I imagine that there are going to be additional questions that pop up over the next, hours, days, weeks. So if that is the case and you want to ask a question, feel free to email me. This is where you can reach me. I'll be happy to just remind me where we connected and give me a little context, and I'll be happy to try to answer anything I can or provide additional links to reading and resources and so forth. And if you haven't already, or if you're not familiar with it, I write a newsletter every Sunday where I send out a new practice hack or a new performance tip. We look at a new study that addresses some aspect of performance or learning, and we take a look at how we can use that in our everyday life. So this is where you can get that. And one last thing too, if you are curious, I mean, who doesn't love an online quiz? So if you like online quizzes and you want to find out more about what could be causing this gap in performance between practice and performance, there's, I think, an 18-question quiz you can take. It'll take 3 minutes, and you can find out which aspect of your mental skills profile could use a little bit more work. So yeah, anyhow, thank you all for being here. It was good to see you.